Welcome back to the chats and the interviews of the European Livestock Voice with the experts of the EAP, the European Federation of Animal Sciences. Today we are joining Professor Sam De Campeneere from Belgium. Good morning, Professor. I know you are the Scientific Director of Animal Husbandry at the Center of Expertise on Agriculture and Climate in Belgium. But I, as usual, let you introduce yourself properly, because you are always people with a very long CV, and it's getting a bit challenging to introduce you. So good morning. First of all, thank you for joining us.
Okay, thank you very much for the introduction. To be clear, I'm not a professor. I'm working at a research institute, so I'm not a professor, but that's the only mistake so far. I graduated.
You all are for me, because
yeah, right. So I graduated as an agriculture engineer, and I finished my PhD in applied biological sciences, where I studied the energy and protein requirements for Belgian blue double muscle bulls, and that was at Ghent University and ILVA at the same time. Ever since the start of my research in 1995, I am working at ILVO, and ILVO is an independent research institute of the Flemish government in Belgium, who is doing research on the whole food chain. We call it most of the time from soil to fork. And currently, in my function, I am responsible for the animal husbandry research domain, where we support the sector in dealing with the most prominent challenges they are facing, like environment, welfare, climate, profitability, etc. And we have research facilities for animal trials in pigs, dairy, and poultry. My connection with EAP is quite long already. It's over 25 years. My first presentation was in The Hague, 2000. I have been also active in the Nutrition Commission. I've been there for 10 years as a secretary and vice president. I also was the main organizer of the EAP conferences in Ghent 2019. And since 2023, I am a member of the council, and I became last year the vice president of science.
Wow, that's quite a close connection, I would say.
Yes, it is.
And yeah, you're not professor, doctor, okay, but I mean, 30 years of experience in animal research, basically. So
right.
The first thing I have to ask you is what are the main changes that you have seen over 3 decades in animal science?
Well, indeed, I've done research myself on beef and dairy, but nowadays I'm overviewing research on the different animal species. And initially, when I started, the focus of the research was almost completely on maximizing profitability of the farmers by maximizing the performance in production and meat quality and product quality. A very nice example is the breed I worked with was the Belgian blue double muscle breed, where farmers really succeeded in reaching huge slaughter efficiencies and very high meat percentages with a high feed efficiency. It was a really nice example of how we maximized production. But slowly, with the decades evolving, that became insufficient, and more projects focused on concerns from society, like environment or animal welfare. In Belgium, for instance, nitrogen and phosphate excretion of animals was a very hot topic in that period. And today,
again, sorry?
Yeah.
When?
Well, in the period between the first decade and the third, let's say the second decade, in the years 90s, like say 19 and the beginning of 2000s, nitrogen and phosphorus was one of the first environmental problems that arose in Belgium. But today, almost all projects are written starting from a certain societal challenge where farmers have to deal with to be able to produce. Themes like animal welfare, climate, environmental impact are almost central in almost all research projects. And we are not talking about maximizing anymore. We are now talking about optimizing within the boundary of certain concerns. We look how farmers and farming systems can be adapted to all those concerns, but still produce enough quality food, because the demand for food is still increasing worldwide. So it's still very important.
Yeah, it's an important thing to underline, because it's I mean, when you speak about the help, the support you give to farmers to increase productivity and having profitable a profitable farm, people nowadays are tending to see only the parts of the profitable. No, we're exploiting animals and so on and so forth. But that's not the point. It's about efficiency, which is also connected to environmental impact, and it's something you worked on as well, as far as I know. So the connection between nutrition and environment. And as you have said, society, Western societies, because I could see the same. I'm dealing with sustainability and environment as a journalist since 20 years, around 20 years. And I started in Italy, and it's more or less the same thing. There was this explosion of in interest or curiosity of the people in these last couple of decades. But when I started, I was taken as a naive, freaky environmentalist. And nowadays, it's even too much, because people are sometimes, again, in good faith, talking about stuff they don't really understand, apparently, like what we're saying about profitability and efficiency and environmental impact. So I wanted to ask you, if you can tell us something about this connection between nutrition and environment, how they impact each other. Because as far as I understood, it's what you're dealing with.
Yeah, that most of the research projects I worked on were around that topic. Well, actually, the basic is quite simple, but I will explain the basic first, and then there are a few elements that make the problem a little bit more complex. But the basic is simple. Animals use nutrients with a certain efficiency. And if we feed more of a certain nutrient than what they need, they will gradually excrete more, which will impact the environment. For example, you feed too much protein, this will lead to increased nitrogen excretion and nitrogen emission. In the past, farmers have been feeding their animals plenty of nutrients to avoid any shortage at any time, because that was their way of maximizing production, as I told you. But nowadays, we have increasing knowledge of, on the one hand, the requirements, on the other hand, the feeding value of the products. Farmers can feed more correctly according to the animal's needs and reduce the excretion. So on the first view, that relation looks easy. Nutrition is determining whether there is a lot of excretion or not. And the better we know the requirements of the animals and the feeding value of feedstuffs, the more precise we can feed them, and in that way reduce environmental load. That is correct as a starting point. However, there are some factors that make the problem more complex, because animals have been historically used to recycle feedstuffs that are not consumable for humans. Think of grasslands in ruminants, or think of waste products that are fed to animals. But in the search of efficiency, however, the past decades, it has caused that parts of the feed of animals also contains quite some human edible products, especially in monogastrics. And with this, their efficiency has become higher because the farmer was looking for high efficiency, and their environmental load was lower. But today, there is an increasing demand to reduce the amount of human edible components in the animal feed. So farmers are criticized because they use those human edible components. And if they have to avoid them, it will be more difficult to have the same environmental load. It will increase the environmental load because they have more difficulty to steer the diet in the right direction. So this will impact the environmental load. Secondly, we also have to take the origin of the certain feedstuffs into account, together with the transportation impact. For instance, you can put the question, is it better to use local soybean meal with a low yield per hectare, but low transport impact, rather than to import soybean meal coming from the best region in the world to produce it, with very high yields and different inputs, but higher transport costs? All these aspects are now taken into account with life cycle analysis, where the impact of production systems and parameters is quantified for different environmental aspects. That's again one step further, but difficulty with those life cycle analysis is, how are we going to weigh the different environmental aspects against each other? What do we feel is most important? Is climate change more important than water quality or biodiversity? So you see, the relation between nutrition and environment is simple, but the solution, how the farmer have to deal with it, with all the concerns, is far from simple. It's quite
Oh, yeah.
difficult.
Quite challenging and
It's very
complex.
challenging. Yeah.
And I mean, if you ask me, that is my personal opinion when it comes to environment, it's I mean, the most important thing is probably the biodiversity loss.
Hmm.
But
Hmm.
I see that in Europe, even more than other places, we are quite obsessed with climate.
Hmm.
I dare to say. So I ask you something probably banal. What are the main myths on climate and livestock, according again to your experience?
Okay, the main myths. Well, one myth is that will not solve the climate problem by stopping animal production in the world. It is sometimes proposed as the easiest solution, but agriculture does have, of course, an important role in global warming. And depending on the way of calculation and which components are involved, the contribution of agriculture in general, including animal production, is between 10 and 20% of global emissions. With that, there is, of course, a large responsibility for agriculture due to its utmost best to reduce their emissions, and it's very logic. But it still should be clear that the main problem for the climate remains the use of fossil fuels, and this should be reduced as soon as possible. And we will not stop that by stopping animal production.
Yeah, the elephant in the room. No?
The
So
elephant in the room. Yep.
see the media very much focused on livestock and then ignoring
Yep.
sometimes in a funny way because there were NGOs and environmentalists focusing. I had this problem sometimes myself on the social media platforms when I mentioned the fact that you know the main source is of climate change of greenhouse emissions are fossil fuels and the energy sector, the transport, and I see tweets or articles only about livestock or
Yeah.
agriculture. Again, surely is an impact, is having an impact, but
There is.
I mean,
Yeah.
if we don't
Uh,
focus, but also for the sake of climate itself, if we don't focus on the main sources of it, I mean, what it doesn't make sense also for the climate itself.
No,
But
it's true.
you were mentioning before the nitrogen issue in Belgium already
Hmm.
a
Hmm.
couple of decades ago, one of the first felt
Yep.
environmental
Yep.
problems in Belgium. So there is some, I would say, some confusion sometimes between the climate problem and the nitrogen one. So can you please clarify for the people watching once and for all the difference between these two issues, please?
Yeah, I will try, but to be honest, it's not that easy. But let's put it in a simple way. The nitrogen problem, in my view, is mainly a local problem. It's a consequence of an excess of nitrogen being deposited in natural habitats, habitats with specific goals for nature preservation, or in the soil with the contamination and eutrophication of the groundwater. That's a nitrogen problem. The nitrogen deposition in EU habitats originate mainly from agricultural ammonia emissions and from NOx emissions from combustion and industry. In many regions with intensive animal production, there is a growing conflict between the nitrogen excreted and the goals of restoring the nature in the habitat directory. And that issue can be dealt with on a local level, and local governments are taking action to reduce the amount of ammonia emission and preserve those habitats. And in general, I think each region should solve that problem on itself by reducing the emissions in their own region. While the climate problem is a global problem, and it's solely a matter of emissions. The different greenhouse gases that we produce, like carbon dioxide, methane, laughing gases, all arrive in the atmosphere and contribute to the increasing effect of global warming, from which the consequences are felt all over the world, regardless the location where the gases are produced. Agriculture is mainly contributing to the climate issue with the methane from entering fermentation of ruminants and manure storage, and the laughing gas that originates from fertilization. And that latter, the laughing gas, is a nitrogen component, which often causes the confusion between climate and nitrogen problem, because there is a greenhouse gas with a nitrogen component in it, and that one is falsely linked with the nitrogen problem. While the laughing gas is not a part of the nitrogen problem, it's a part of the climate problem. And in my view, to solve the climate issue, which is a global issue, you can only do it by making worldwide agreements to make a shift from burning fossil fuels towards sustainable energy production while reducing all emissions of greenhouse gases, also including the ones of agriculture, as soon as possible. But the practical and economical impact is that huge that you can only do it on the level of global and not on a regional level.
Good luck with that. It seems more, it seems easier to me to reduce, not stop using fossil fuels than finding an international agreement sometimes, but
Yeah, I know.
we try. But sorry,
I know.
just one last thing. Speaking of emissions and GHGs, the question of methane. Does it make sense? Because I see, from my perspective, too often use methane to, I mean, to justify some actions. Let's make it easier. So the fact to use always this CO2 equivalent meter, does it make sense? Because we're speaking of two different things, and I see often livestock, cattle in particular, attacked with the excuse of methane, which is an important thing. But I mean, the fact to use always CO2 equivalent, does it make sense in your opinion?
Well, I'm not a specialist on that field, but there's no other solution. I think for some goals, you have to put all aspects on the same unit to make calculations and to make conclusions. But you have to be very careful on which method you use for which conclusions, and that's a difficulty. Even IPCC has evaluated different ways of how to involve the methane emissions and to calculate the CO2 equivalence of that. And depending on how you calculate it, you come to different conclusions, and that's always very, very difficult to work with. In my view, methane is the greenhouse gas that does not stay too long in the atmosphere. After 12 years, it starts disappearing. And you could say that if the worldwide output of enteric methane would stabilize, then there is not really a climate issue anymore, because there will be as much new methane coming in the atmosphere as the number of methane that is degraded from the atmosphere. The problem is, of course, if the sector is growing, then you have an increase in methane. But the reason why a lot of people are also focusing on methane is that same short lifetime of methane. And there you have to be honest that reducing methane might help to give us a kind of a lifeline. It could be a way of, in a short term, reducing the greenhouse effect. If we reduce CO2 today, we will only profit from that reduction within 2 centuries or something like that. If we reduce methane emissions today, we will profit from that within decades. So that's the reason why some people are looking at methane more directly to be reduced, because it could help alleviating the problem a little bit on the short term. And to my view, I can agree on that, on the condition that the main focus is on the fossil fuel and reducing those.
Yeah, which are producing CO2, which is staying 1,000 years, not
thousands of years, hundreds of years. Yeah.
So I completely agree, of course, and also I think as I was talking about climate in general and emissions in general, also about methane. Now it's here my job also to take the stand for the livestock, but according to the data, the main sources of methane emissions again are not it's not livestock, but landfills, fossil fuel extractions. I mean, there are also major sources which are not really present on the media as far as I'm concerned.
That's for sure. I think if you talk about natural sources, I think methane from enteric emission is one of the largest. But indeed, rice culture, landfills are also quite important numbers of meat that is produced. And in my view, the amount of methane that is lost in the search for fossil fuels by, for instance, gas losses is also very huge. And I don't think we have really correct numbers to quantify that.
Yeah, no, I'm referring to a study they made a couple of years ago in which they were spotting from the satellites
Yep. Yep.
the methane
Yep.
without calculating how much, but the major spots were on the landfills in cities like Indian
Okay. Yep.
cities or Buenos Aires, and
Right.
the main extraction fields of fossil
Yeah.
fuels.
Yeah.
So that
Yeah.
was impressive.
That's also
But
very indeed. And actually, these are things that could be alleviated quite easily
on the short term, yes.
on the short term.
Yeah.
Yeah, in my view. Yeah.
Well, Doctor, Dr. De Campeneere, not Professor De Campeneere. No, thank you very much again. It was
You're
very
welcome.
interesting, very nice, and and I hope we can catch up again soon because you're like your colleagues we're talking with these days. Plenty of interesting
Sure.
informations and things to talk about. So
Okay.
thank you again for your time
You're
and
welcome.
I wish you all the best.
Okay.